Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some surprising trade news coming out of the San Jose Sharks camp today, and that is that they have traded away defenseman Matt Benning along with a third-round pick and a sixth-round pick to the Toronto Maple Leafs in exchange for defenseman Timothy Liljegren. Now, this is a trade somewhat similar to the one the Sharks made at the beginning of last season when they went out and picked up Calen Addison from the Minnesota Wild. Mike Grier not happy with the season start that the Sharks have had, at least prior to these last couple of wins, and so looking to address a very obvious issue with the Sharks roster, which is their lack of defensive talent, as well as their lack of offense coming from the back end as well. And this is a trade that manages to do both of those. Now, let's start first with what the Sharks actually ended up giving up here. First of all, Matt Benning being the player that the Sharks moved on from. He was someone who had clearly become rather expendable. A couple of years ago, when the Sharks had originally signed him out of free agency for a pretty cheap deal, he was actually performing rather well for the team. Behind Erik Karlsson and Mario Ferraro that year, he was likely the Sharks' third best defenseman. But unfortunately for him, last season he had a major injury that kept him out most of the year. And so coming into this season, it was unknown just what level of play we'd actually end up getting from Matt Benning. And after the first few games of the season, it was quite clear that that level of play was exceptionally low, that even on a team that doesn't have really all that much defensive talent, Matt Benning was still being outperformed by pretty much everybody, and he was a liability on the ice, which did cause him to get benched for multiple games in favor of Jack Thompson. And while he would eventually end up back into the lineup, he did in fact even play these last couple of wins for San Jose, it was quite clear that Warsofsky had very little trust in him, giving him the least amount of ice time amongst all defensemen, and so indeed a very expendable asset here for the Sharks. The bigger pieces, perhaps, that the Sharks are giving up are the sixth-round pick, which isn't that much, but then also the third-round pick, which is a lot more notable. Sure, it doesn't carry the value of a first-rounder. That would be an absolutely crazy move for the Sharks to make, but a third-rounder can still produce some relatively quality NHL talent. For instance, if you take a look at the Sharks' top six from these last few games, you'll notice Danil Gushchin present in that top six. He was a third-rounder from a few years ago, and I'd say he's been pretty good thus far in this season. So it is not a high price to pay, but it is still something that can't just be completely written off either. Now, what do the Sharks end up receiving in such a deal? Well, it is just the singular player, Timothy Liljegren, right-handed defenseman, very important to mention, from the Toronto Maple Leafs. And the reactions to this trade range from, wow, the Sharks are getting someone who could end up being a top four defenseman, to, wow, I can't believe the Sharks went out and picked up a AHL level defenseman. I imagine the truth lands somewhere in the middle of that, but it should be the case that Liljegren will be an upgrade over Matt Benning, who, like I said, couldn't even make the top six on a team as bad as the San Jose Sharks. He did play a good chunk of games with the Toronto Maple Leafs last year, but with their coaching staff change and likely the philosophy change around the team as well, he was no longer a very real fit. And considering the Maple Leafs are right up against the salary cap as they usually are, the $3 million that Liljegren was making was something that they couldn't really swallow all that easily. So getting Matt Benning's significantly cheaper contract here makes a lot more sense for them. Now, what is interesting here about Liljegren is that this might just seem like a defenseman for defenseman trade, not anything particularly special about it, and the Sharks have just added the couple of draft picks. But when it comes to Matt Benning, he was already 30 years old. His future with the San Jose Sharks likely wasn't there. In 2 to 3 years' time, is he still going to be a part of this organization? Well, clearly not now, but even at the time prior to this trade, it didn't feel as though that was the case. When it comes to Liljegren, however, while he is a somewhat established defenseman in the league currently, he's still actually rather young at just 25 years of age. While you're not expecting a ton of player growth at this time, this is usually the prime years for defensemen or players in general in the NHL, it should be noted that, for instance, compared to a player like Henry Thrun, who many Sharks fans, including myself, still see as sort of a young, raw type of talent, Thrun is only 2 years younger than Liljegren. By the time the Sharks are actually competitive again, which can hopefully be within 3 to 4 years' time, Liljegren would still be under the age of 30. So this is a player who could very much factor into the Sharks in the future, especially since, like I mentioned, he is that right-handed shot. When you take a look at many of the Sharks' young prospect defensemen, you've got Thrun, Mukhamadullin, Dickinson, Cagnoni, all of these guys left-handed. So to have someone who is still somewhat young, older than the rest, but not all that close to 30 to be around here. As long as he actually plays pretty well, he could be more of a future player for the San Jose Sharks. Now, it also does give San Jose hopefully an immediate upgrade in their team. We have talked at length over this entire season about the Mario Ferraro-Jan Rutta pairing that has just been a disaster on the ice, but that Warsofsky has refused to actually separate. This is finally the help that he would need, and hopefully the convincing that he needs to actually keep those two players apart. The Sharks' top four can now become Wallman, Ceci, and then Ferraro paired with Liljegren. That will give a bit more of a puck-moving defenseman. He cannot possibly be any worse in that area than Jan Rutta has been this season, and that creates a bit more depth here to move Jan Rutta down with someone like Henry Thrun, which is a pairing that the Sharks did run with a lot last season. Now, there is one possible downside that does need to be talked about for this trade, which is that about a week ago I made a video discussing the imminent return of, in particular, Shakir Mukhamadullin to the Sharks lineup. He had been injured for the large chunk of the start of this season, so he didn't really have a chance to prove himself in preseason, but it did seem as though the Sharks had actually planned on having Mukhamadullin get NHL games this year. With Liljegren having been picked up now, it is going to be slightly more difficult, because just 24 hours ago, you're thinking, well, Benning is a very easy bench, if not even an easy waived player. That creates a bit more room for Mukhamadullin to come into the roster. Without that now, if we do say that Wallman, Ceci, Liljegren, Ferraro are an established top four, and then your second pair or your third pairing is Thrun and Rutta, now there is a bit more of a competition. We already know Warsofsky is a fan of Rutta, so how much is he actually going to be willing to healthy scratch Rutta throughout this season is a big question mark. You've got Thompson, who you might want to get some NHL games for. You have Mukhamadullin, who you might want to get some NHL games for. And then, of course, Thrun being that sixth guy already. We've seen Warsofsky be more so willing to healthy scratch him just based on last game yesterday where he did exactly that. So it is very possible that by the end of this, the Sharks will only end up giving time to one of their three NHL young ready defensemen in time in this lineup because of this acquisition, since Liljegren is obviously not going to end up getting healthy scratched or waived at any point, most likely this season. So sure, you could say, well, by the time the trade deadline rolls around, or as we get closer to it, the Sharks might trade Ceci or they might trade Rutta. In the immediate future, there is less room for these young players to actually get time in the NHL with the San Jose Sharks. So that does seem to be the one downside, but besides that, unless you are someone sitting here and thinking that you don't really have a lot of faith in Liljegren to actually be particularly good, and so then you are just simply upset with the fact that the Sharks gave up 2 draft picks for a player that you don't think factors into the Sharks into the future, that is a possibility, and I can understand not liking that trade for that reason. But if there's anything even close to being here for Liljegren that he could prove himself to be even just like a good third pairing defenseman for San Jose, I can't say that I hate this trade, because realistically, even with a third round pick, your odds of getting a really high talented individual is rather low, and so getting just someone who can perform in the NHL as a third pairing, maybe second pairing defenseman is relatively equal value. And since a 6th round pick has relatively low value and Matt Benning has pretty much 0 value, I'd say it was a pretty good deal for the Sharks. Class dismissed.